The terror of isolation grips harder than almost any other human fear. Walking through life without constant validation, facing decisions without the comfort of consensus, and standing apart from the crowd creates anxiety so profound that most people will compromise their deepest values to avoid it. Society has conditioned minds to interpret aloneness as failure, as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with the isolated individual. The voices inside whisper relentlessly that if no one stands with you, you must be mistaken. That if you find yourself separated from the masses, you have taken a wrong turn. Yet Machiavelli observed a paradox that few grasp. Those who achieve genuine power, who build lasting influence, who create works that endure, inevitably find themselves alone at critical junctures. The path that leads somewhere meaningful diverges sharply from the well-traveled roads where crowds congregate. Aloneness is not the punishment for doing something wrong, but the inevitable consequence of doing something right. Understanding why requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature, power dynamics, and the price that excellence demands. The crowd fears what it cannot control. When someone begins operating by principles that differ from collective norms, the crowd's initial response is not admiration, but anxiety. This anxiety stems from a deep psychological need for predictability and conformity that keeps social groups stable. The person who thinks independently, who questions accepted wisdom, who pursues goals that don't align with common ambitions, represents a threat to the collective's cohesion. Machiavelli understood that groups maintain their integrity through enforcing similarity, through punishing deviation, and through isolating those who will not conform. The emotional experience of the crowd when confronted with genuine independence is complex and largely unconscious. On the surface, they may express concern, offering warnings disguised as care about the isolated person's well-being. Beneath this concern lies fear mixed with resentment. The independent person's existence implies that the crowd's choices are not inevitable, that different paths are possible, that the comfort of conformity comes at a cost. This implication triggers defensive reactions because accepting it would require examining their own compromises and surrendered autonomy. The isolation that results is not accidental abandonment, but active exclusion. The crowd withdraws from those who will not conform, creating social pressure designed to force the deviant back into acceptable patterns. Invitations stop arriving, conversations become strained, and previously close relationships cool into distant formality. This withdrawal is presented as the natural consequence of the isolated person's choices, but it operates as punishment and warning to others who might consider similar independence. The psychological pressure of this exclusion is enormous because humans are social creatures with deep needs for belonging and acceptance. What the crowd fails to recognize is that their exclusion confirms rather than contradicts the correctness of the independent path. Machiavelli observed that those who achieve anything significant always face opposition from the mediocre masses who resent excellence they cannot match. The person who finds themselves alone after refusing to compromise their vision, after maintaining standards the crowd considers unrealistic, after pursuing goals the masses deem impossible, should interpret this isolation not as failure, but as evidence they have separated themselves from those destined for mediocrity. The emotional challenge for the isolated person is resisting the powerful pull to return to the comfortable embrace of conformity. The human need for social acceptance is so strong that it overrides rational judgment about what serves one's true interests. The isolated person experiences waves of doubt, questioning whether their independence is actually stubbornness, whether their standards are actually arrogance, whether their vision is actually delusion. These doubts intensify during moments of difficulty when the lack of support feels most acute. Yet surrendering to these doubts and returning to the crowd means abandoning the very qualities that made excellence possible. Mediocrity requires company. Excellence demands solitude. The psychological dynamics of groups naturally pull toward the average. When decisions are made collectively, the result tends toward compromise that accommodates the lowest common denominator. When standards are set by consensus, they settle at levels achievable by most, rather than demanding what only few can accomplish. When goals are chosen democratically, ambition is moderated to match what the majority finds reasonable. Machiavelli recognized that greatness cannot emerge from these group dynamics because greatness, by definition, exceeds average capabilities and comfortable aspirations. The person committed to excellence finds that maintaining high standards requires separation from those who would lower them. This separation is not hostile or contemptuous, but practical. The excellent person cannot allow their standards to be negotiated downward through exposure to those satisfied with less. They cannot permit their ambitions to be moderated by those who find such ambitions threatening or unrealistic. They cannot submit their vision to democratic approval from those who lack the capacity to understand what that vision might achieve. The emotional experience of maintaining excellence in isolation is exhausting because it means constant self-generated motivation without external reinforcement. The crowd provides regular feedback that validates efforts and confirms that one is on the right path. The excellent person operating in isolation must generate their own validation, must trust their own judgment without the comfort of consensus, and must persist despite the absence of evidence that others recognize the value of their work. This psychological burden is heavy enough that most people abandon excellence to rejoin the crowd where effort is regularly rewarded with approval. The isolation of excellence also means facing one's own limitations without the buffer of shared responsibility. In groups, failure can be distributed and diluted across multiple people, but the isolated person bears full responsibility for their results. This responsibility creates pressure that many find unbearable, preferring to sacrifice potential excellence for the comfort of shared mediocrity, where individual accountability is minimized. The person who accepts this pressure and continues pursuing excellence despite lacking support demonstrates rare psychological strength that itself contributes to their eventual success. What makes this isolation particularly difficult is that excellence often goes unrecognized during its development. The crowd can only appreciate results that it understands, and truly excellent work often creates new categories or operates at levels beyond common comprehension. The excellent person labors in isolation not only without support, but often without recognition that what they are attempting has value. They must maintain conviction in their work based entirely on internal standards rather than external validation, trusting that excellence will eventually be recognized even if that recognition comes long after the work is complete. Truth-tellers are always exiled first. Speaking truth in environments built on comfortable lies guarantees isolation. Machiavelli observed that most social systems rely on shared fictions that allow people to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities about themselves, their society, or their circumstances. These fictions serve important psychological functions by protecting egos, maintaining social cohesion, and allowing people to believe their compromises are principled choices rather than surrenders to pressure. The person who speaks plainly about these fictions threatens the entire psychological structure that keeps people comfortable in their mediocrity. The emotional response to truth-telling is almost never gratitude, but anger. The person whose comfortable illusions are challenged experiences this challenge as attack, even when the truth-teller's motivation is help rather than harm. The psychological investment in maintaining illusions is enormous because accepting truth would require painful reevaluation of choices, relationships, and self-concept. Rather than undertake this difficult work, most people attack the messenger, dismissing the truth-teller as cynical, arrogant, or lacking understanding of nuances that supposedly make the lies acceptable. The isolation of the truth-teller is particularly complete because they are excluded not just socially, but morally. The crowd frames the truth teller as the problem, as someone whose negativity or judgment creates discomfort that would not exist if they would simply accept the polite fictions everyone else maintains. This moral framing allows the crowd to feel righteous in their exclusion, to believe they are protecting themselves from a harmful influence rather than punishing someone for exposing their self-deception. The truth teller finds themselves cast as villain in a narrative where they believed they were offering clarity. Machiavelli understood that truth-telling requires accepting this exile as inevitable price of honesty. The person who speaks truth cannot expect appreciation or understanding from those comfortable in their illusions. They must find satisfaction in the truth itself rather than in others' recognition of it. This psychological shift from external to internal validation is crucial for surviving the isolation that truth-telling creates. The truth teller who continues seeking approval from the crowd will eventually soften their honesty, compromising truth to regain acceptance until they become one more voice maintaining the comfortable lies they once challenged. The long-term vindication of truth tellers provides cold comfort during the isolation they endure. Eventually, circumstances force recognition of truths that were denied, and the truth teller is sometimes belatedly acknowledged as having been right all along. But this vindication often comes too late to repair the damage done by years of isolation, and it rarely includes genuine apology from those who attacked the truth teller for their honesty. The person who speaks truth must accept that they do so not for eventual recognition, but because their constitution cannot tolerate participating in collective delusion, regardless of the social cost. Power accumulates in silence, dissipates in crowds. The psychological need to share plans, to discuss strategies, and to seek input on decisions is powerful but counterproductive for those building genuine power. Machiavelli recognized that speaking about intentions before execution creates multiple vulnerabilities. First, it allows others to prepare countermeasures or position themselves to benefit from one's efforts. Second, it invites input that dilutes clarity and introduces compromises that weaken the original vision. Third, it creates accountability to others' expectations rather than to one's own standards. The person who shares their plans with crowds finds their power dispersed before they ever attempt to exercise it. The emotional challenge of silence is that it means bearing the weight of decisions alone without the comfort of validation or the relief of shared responsibility. The person operating in silence must trust their own judgment completely, because no external confirmation is available until after execution, when results speak for themselves. This psychological burden is substantial enough that most people seek the temporary relief of sharing their thoughts even when doing so undermines their strategic position. They trade long-term power for short-term comfort of feeling understood and supported. The isolation required for power accumulation is not merely physical, but mental and emotional. It means maintaining clear vision despite the absence of others who share that vision. It means persisting in strategies that no one else validates or even understands. It means accepting that explanations and justifications will only be possible after success makes the approach self-evident. This level of isolation requires psychological resources that most people have never developed because they have always operated within supportive social contexts that provided regular feedback and adjustment based on others' reactions. Machiavelli observed that those who achieve significant power almost always report having felt profoundly alone during the period when they were building that power. This aloneness is not coincidental, but causal. The silence and isolation that feel like abandonment are actually the necessary conditions for accumulating the focused energy and clear vision that power requires. The person who cannot bear this isolation, who repeatedly breaks their silence to seek validation or share their progress, dissipates the very energy they need to succeed. They end up with detailed plans that everyone knows about, but no power to execute them because the crowd has already adapted to neutralize what they openly announce they would attempt. The lonely path leads somewhere, the crowded road goes nowhere. The well-traveled paths that crowds follow are popular precisely because they lead to destinations most people find acceptable. These paths offer comfort, company, and the security of knowing that many others have successfully reached the same endpoint. But Machiavelli understood that these popular destinations are by definition unremarkable because they are accessible to anyone willing to follow the crowd. The person who desires to reach somewhere that matters, somewhere that offers genuine advantage or accomplishment, must be willing to travel paths that are unpopular precisely because they are difficult and uncertain. The psychological appeal of crowded roads is powerful because they offer constant reassurance that one is heading in the right direction. The presence of others serves as validation that the chosen path is legitimate, sensible, and likely to succeed. This reassurance feels like wisdom, but often represents nothing more than collective fear, masquerading as prudence. The crowd gravitates towards certain paths not because careful analysis shows these paths lead to the best destinations, but because these paths feel safest due to their popularity. This circular reasoning traps most people in pursuing goals that thousands of others are simultaneously pursuing, ensuring that even success on these paths leads to unremarkable destinations. The isolated path feels terrifying because it offers no such reassurance. The person traveling alone cannot look to others for confirmation that they are heading in the right direction. They cannot draw comfort from the presence of fellow travelers who share their struggles. They cannot reduce their uncertainty by observing that many others have successfully reached the destination they seek. This lack of reassurance creates persistent anxiety that can only be managed through deep conviction in one's own judgment and willingness to accept that meaningful destinations require difficult journeys. Machiavelli recognized that the crowd's rejection of difficult paths is itself evidence that these paths lead somewhere valuable. If the destination were easily accessible and obviously worthwhile, crowds would already be pursuing it. The fact that a path is lonely, that few choose it despite its potential value, indicates that it requires qualities most people lack or sacrifices most people will not make. The person willing to travel this lonely path has already distinguished themselves through their willingness to endure isolation that others find intolerable. The emotional experience of the lonely path oscillates between doubt and conviction. During moments of difficulty, when progress is slow and the absence of support feels most acute, doubt emerges with overwhelming force. The isolated person questions whether they are actually pursuing something valuable or simply too stubborn to admit they have chosen wrongly. These moments of doubt are psychologically crucial because they represent decision points where the person either strengthens their commitment or abandons their path to rejoin the crowd. Those who persist through doubt without external validation develop psychological resilience that itself becomes a competitive advantage, while those who surrender to doubt and return to crowded paths never develop this essential quality. The eventual arrival at meaningful destinations validates the isolation endured, but rarely provides the satisfaction imagined during the journey. By the time the isolated person reaches their goal, they have often changed so fundamentally through the journey that the achievement feels less like arrival at a destination and more like confirmation of transformation. The crowds that rejected their path may eventually recognize the value of where they have reached, but this recognition typically comes too late to repair the relationships damaged by years of mutual incomprehension. The person who traveled the lonely path finds themselves in the paradoxical position of having reached somewhere remarkable, but having few people with whom to share the achievement because those who could understand it are themselves traveling other lonely paths rather than gathering in comfortable crowds.